Targeting me won't get their money back. I knew the mob wouldn't go down without a fight, but this is different. They've crossed the line.
You crossed the line first, sir. You squeezed them, you hammered them to the point of desperation. And in their desperation, they turned to a man they didn't fully understand.
Criminals aren't complicated, Alfred. We just need to figure out what he's after.
With respect, Master Wayne, perhaps this is a man you don't fully understand either. A long time ago, I was in Burma. My friends and I were working for the local government. They were trying to buy the loyalty of tribal leaders by bribing them with precious stones. But their caravans were being raided in a forest north of Rangoon by a bandit. So we went looking for the stones. But in 6 months, we never met anyone who traded with him. One day, I saw a child playing with a ruby the size of a tangerine. The bandit had been throwing them away.
So why steal them?
Well, because he thought it was good sport, because some men aren't looking for anything logical, like money. They can't be bought, bullied, reasoned, or negotiated with. Some men just want to watch the world burn.
I just did what I do best. I took your little plan and I turned it on itself. Look what I did to this city with a few drums of gas and a couple of bullets. You know what I noticed? Nobody panics when things go according to plan. Even if the plan is horrifying. If tomorrow I tell the press that, like, a gangbanger will get shot, or a truckload of soldiers will be blowing up, nobody panics. Because it's all part of the plan. But when I say that one little old mare will die, well, then everyone loses their minds. Introduce a little anarchy. Upset the established order, and everything becomes chaos. I'm an agent of chaos. Oh, and you know the thing about chaos? It's fear.
Please don't mess up the camera, and there we go. Welcome everybody to your first official lecture for 301. I am very excited to get going. Hopefully you guys are at least semi-prepared for the lecture. The good thing about doing an online class is that it's completely up to you to decide how you want to go about this. If you want to write down notes, you totally can. If you want to listen to this on an audio version, I'd be more than happy to hopefully make a podcast eventually where you guys can just listen to my voice and listen to me ramble the entire time. I also hope that you guys can, if there's a certain portion where you can pause and skip. Obviously our videos are a little bit longer. I like the longer videos just because I'm able to edit it really easily, and if there is a certain portion where you guys stop, you can come back to just keep track of it. If you have any questions about the lecture that we are going to go over, let me know. As we start this lecture, I want to just talk really briefly about why I played something from Batman. Many of you probably may or may not know this, but that movie was The Dark Knight. That was two clips from The Dark Knight. And the reason is because we're talking about political philosophy, and as much as Batman is a superhero movie, it is also a very political movie as well, especially The Dark Knight. That particular movie talks a lot about Batman and the Joker as two opposite ends of a coin. And what I like about The Dark Knight is that it really does kind of present this very political view of what basic democracies are based after, which is the ability to control chaos and what all governments are really based after. But democracy especially is like a very fine line between chaos and order. And that's what we're really going to be talking about today, is how the Founding Fathers came to this decision through political philosophy and the philosophers who came before them to make this form of government, and why they thought this was maybe the best form or the next progression in human evolution past a certain point for government control. Again, governments are designed to control chaos. And in Batman, the ultimate level of chaos is the Joker. And the Joker is not only the exact opposite of Batman in terms of who he is and what he thinks, but in The Dark Knight especially, he's trying to show, his main goal is to show that everybody loves chaos, that people inherently have chaos within them. This is a really good interpretation of actually one of the philosophers we're going to talk about, which is Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes is believed in a very central idea that almost all people are evil and have something in them that is animalistic, and really they need government to control them. Where the Joker doesn't really believe in that government control, he wanted to prove that the chaos was there inside of all of us. And Batman is on the other side saying he's just a criminal, all he wants is money, all he wants is power. And then his butler, Alfred, who is sitting there saying, I don't think you really understand him as a person. He is there just because he wants to do this for fun. He thinks that this is good sport. It's because some men just want to watch the world burn. Where the Joker is chaos, Batman is representative of order and trying to preserve that order. And Batman is much more idealistic about human beings and who they are, and believes that they are inherently good and they should choose who they want or how they want their city to be run, especially the citizens of Gotham. So that's what this whole movie is about, obviously. But this really kind of presents that central argument that our founding fathers still argued about, and that what we still argue about today. Are people essentially good and should be trusted with their own government, or should they be governed in some way? And even Batman kind of crosses over from that point of being the person who believes that people are good. He still uses certain technology that's very sort of crosses over into a gray area. When we talk about privacy and rights, this is something we'll discuss, and how our government uses and tries to limit our rights. But maybe that's for the best, because maybe we need to be protected in some way. And this is something we're going to discuss when it comes to civil liberties and government control. And this movie really lays that out really well. And it's a really interesting look at politics through superhero movie. So it's one of my favorite movies because it does that, and it kind of presents this idea that politics is just a fine line between, or in human beings are really just a fine line between order and chaos. And people go back and forth between the two. If you have never watched the movie, I definitely would watch it and see what comes of the discussion from that, because it really is an interesting movie to kind of pick apart and understand human beings in general, and it's not just a superhero movie. It's a very thinly veiled look at human nature. And I really suggest, if you guys are interested in more about political philosophy, to talk about this, because it actually is a really good interpretation of what we're going to be talking about today, which is the philosophy of politics. Really, the first part of political philosophy starts with the Enlightenment period. Is man to be trusted with his own destiny? That is the very first question that really the Enlightenment was asking. In the 16th century all the way to about the 17th, 18th century in Europe and in the United States especially, which it hit the United States later, but especially in Europe in the beginning portion, where people began to question who they were, what culture was, what they were supposed to be in the world. And this is where a lot of art came forward. This is where people began to question the ideas of religion and politics and many things about their society. And it was this revolutionary movement that took 200 years, but I mean, it was a very interesting portion in human history. So we're going to talk a lot about that. The questioning of government control came from the idea of questioning, what is man? Is man supposed to be controlled, have this huge government control because human nature is chaos? Or are humans allowed to have their liberties because human nature isn't chaos? Human beings actually want order and structure. And this is a very fundamental view of the world, and we are still having these arguments today, just in very, very different ways. But we have these arguments about what is government control, what should government's role be, and that's these same arguments we're having 400 years later. We're trying to figure this all out still. An enlightened person was someone who sought the truth about previously unquestioned truths, and this is new thinking. Led to new action. This new type of thinking led to significant action in the world, and people questioning different parts of the world. Isaac Newton questioning the ideas of just gravity and how the world worked, astronomy, all sorts of things, and it really challenged the authority, and we're going to talk about the authority, especially of the Catholic Church. An enlightened person was no follower of the clergy, nor did he believe in magic too. So usually this person was not of a priestly nature, and they weren't involved in belief in magic too. That's how a lot of people explain things before the Enlightenment period, it was either God or magic who was working through, instead of just maybe somebody had medicine or healing. They read books and journals. They went to coffee houses, salons, and Masonic lodges, which we'll talk more about. And they traveled the world as well. If you travel the world, I think if anybody has really traveled at any significant portion of their life, it starts to broaden your horizons a little bit and starts to help you question the world around you. Why certain things are a certain way in one culture and they're not that way in your culture. And people start to share things and innovate together. Travel and traveling the world has really brought us closer together. The internet, especially, is one of those things where, people can travel, quote unquote, somewhere and see something that people 400 years ago never would have thought they could ever see, except maybe in paintings. And now people can travel very easily. You can get around the world in 24 hours. I mean, that is something very significant that we take for granted in our own society. But back then, it really was. If people traveled even just a couple hundred miles too from their hometown, they really got to see a different side of the world. A lot of them were non-church going atheists as well. Atheism was really growing at this point, and a lot of it was because of discontent with the church and their control, and we'll talk more about that. But atheists were really important to kind of questioning if there is no God, and that's a really significant thing, especially at this point, to say in a very controlled Catholic environment. It was an age of reason, so it was sought to reform society using reason instead of just saying something was because of this and following leadership. It was reasoned was because of logic. It was a cultural movement of intellectuals through the 17th and 18th century Europe and America. It started somewhere closer to the 1600s all the way to the 1700s and a little bit into the 1800s too. But it challenged the ideas and grounded in faith and tradition by using scientific methods to produce science and support intellectual discourse. And using science and reason and fact was really important, and we're definitely going to talk about facts more as the weeks go on. The scientific method was important to making sure people understood that there is a way to prove stuff, and there's steps you can take to prove something. It was able to challenge the authority of the kings and church, and to point out illogic, intolerance, and abuses of those royal authorities or those hierarchical authorities in the church. Some key people we're going to be talking about, and really there's a couple people that I want to mention just to start with. There's first Isaac Newton. He wasn't the very first one, but he was really important in terms of establishing scientific fact and proof. He was a key influencer in questioning the man's ability to establish hierarchy of society, and he really challenged the church on their beliefs, especially on the theory of gravity, which the church didn't like, that it could be explained by science. Usually something was just explained by God. He really challenged the theories and practices of the church and tried to question the world around them. It was a scary time for the church because there was a man who was using fact and reason, and people were seeing and able to see that fact and reason, and maybe almost made his work more important because of they were so vehemently against it. There's also Voltaire, who wrote the Letters Concerning the English Nations, which results in the United Kingdom's freedoms. He lived between 1694 and 1778. And Voltaire believed that through education and reason, man could separate himself from the beast. Being able to separate yourself because of education was an especially important part of Voltaire's thinking, and he believed in anti-establishment of religion and power and advocated for freedom of speech and separation of church and state. Again, this is something that would come up later on when the Founding Fathers were putting forward the Constitution, and definitely they read Voltaire. Diderot was another one who wrote the Encyclopedia, one of the first encyclopedias of volumes that contributed to knowledge. And again, they were living at a time where people did not have access to the internet, did not have access to even books sometimes too. All the books that they were talking about were pieced together with different parts of information people learn about the world. But the encyclopedia was the first place people could go to and reference and find information. And that was really important because if people had a central place where they know that they could go to an encyclopedia and look things up and find information, that was a really key step to building out education for the middle class, the poor, those who weren't in the elites or established. It helped people find a central location for education. So it helped a wide range of people in all walks of life. And that building of education, it was a very simple book to explain complex topics. So that simplifying of information, it gave people a better way to find that information and go seek it out and know where to find something. What we're going to talk about most, at least over this next week, are the three main philosophers: Thomas Hobbes, who wrote Leviathan, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And those are the three that I really want to talk about most, because they are the essential building blocks for the arguments that we're still having today. So Thomas Hobbes, we'll start with him. He wrote the Leviathan, and he was born in 1588. He lived till 1679, and he believed in pro-absolutism, which is the belief that man is a savage. Saying that man is a savage is a really controversial thing at that time, especially. Basically, he believed that human beings should give obedience to an unaccountable sovereignty. He believed in universal insecurity, where we all have reason to fear violent death, human cooperation, and human cooperation is impossible. So basically, he believed that human beings were selfish, they were chaotic, they were meant to destroy one another, and that there should be a supreme overall being that would come in and be able to control everything. That human beings were chaos, and that the government was a way to control that chaos. Many people believe that, I'm sure there's many people who believe in a stronger government, but don't necessarily believe in an absolute, complete control over human beings, or that human beings are chaotic, or that they are violent. Sometimes human beings can be, but maybe that's not who we are, but maybe that's part of our society. And we'll talk more. Again, this is why the philosophers were having these debates, because we can still debate this same thing till today. This began the argument that man should be controlled and should have some sort of government authority to have the power, or have power over them, and to be able to make sure that man doesn't act on his impulses because he is a savage and he's an animal. One of the founding philosophers for Alexander Hamilton, who we'll talk extensively about because I am reading about him right now and have seen him play as well. So I really want to talk more about Hamilton and what he meant to the revolution, and also what his beliefs were. But Hobbes was really the first part of Hamilton's experience in trying to establish the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, and many other things from that point too. Hamilton had a very firm belief that human beings were chaotic and violent and needed to be controlled in some way. And his arguments were sort of misconstrued to be very controlling, but he in general was not that controlling. So I will have to talk about him more, but there's a lot about Hamilton that we'll talk about. The second one that I really want to lay out on the opposite end of Hobbes is John Locke. And John Locke wrote the Second Treatise on Government. He lays out the thinking of the social contract and what social contract theory is. And he lived between 1632 and 1704. So him and Hobbes only overlapped for a certain amount of years and probably never really officially met each other. I'm not even sure about that. But he believed that man has natural rights, and governments are there to provide citizens with protection and should be for the people. He really did believe that man was good and man should have the right to do whatever they felt like, that there was no need for a government because man would be able to create a government or self-sustain themselves. Man can overthrow government if they choose to live up to the standards of free thought. So again, kind of challenging people to think beyond just their backyard, and saying, if government is oppressive and controlling and they control others around me and myself, we should rise up and overthrow these governments. And it was the essential right of people to do that, to overthrow, and they had rights too. Again, mostly at this time, there were mostly monarchies in the world. And a lot of these monarchies were abusive and powerful and hierarchical and just never really allowed for any growth for anybody. But a democracy was there to, or could be there to help people grow in themselves and move up in the world. And that was a really essential idea for Locke. And he really is the forefather for people like Thomas Jefferson, who, again, was the opposite of Alexander Hamilton. and he really opposed the ideas of large governments who control people. Jefferson's ideas really were about, he really didn't even like the Constitution that much because he thought it was almost too controlling. And there were many times where he would clash with Hamilton and many other founding fathers because he had essential beliefs that there should not be big governments. If big governments are there, then people are going to be hurt by big governments, and people are going to be controlled by big governments, and people should be allowed to do whatever they feel like. And that was an essential part for Jefferson. And so we'll talk a lot about Jefferson as well. Jefferson is a key player in the forming of the country to counteract Hamilton's ideas, especially, but he really started this whole fight between these two, and really Jefferson and Hamilton are the reasons we have a two-party system now. And the two parties we talk about, Democrats and Republicans today, one argues for less government and one argues for more government. And this is the same, again, same arguments that we keep having over and over and over again, and we'll probably never solve. There's one man who we're going to talk about, who I think is kind of like the middle ground between Hamilton and Jefferson and Locke and Hobbes. That was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and he wrote the ideas of the social contract. Rousseau was interesting because he kind of crystallizes this debate between Hobbes and Locke, and he's kind of the first one to take both of their ideas and come up with a middle ground to try to create some sort of idea for democracy. He's born in 1712 and lived to 1778, and Rousseau believed the opposite of Voltaire. Knowledge had made man greedy and corrupt. So really, it wasn't so much that man himself was evil. Rousseau didn't believe that. He actually believed people were good by nature, but society was the evil. Society had created man to be greedy and corrupt, and he looked at the world around him, especially in France too, which was opulent in wealth at this point, especially, but this is before the French Revolution. France had a very distinct line between the wealthy and the elite and the poor and the downtrodden. Selfishness and greed had corrupted what could be good people. And Rousseau kind of decided that there had to be a middle ground at least, or maybe not just in his thinking, but he kind of, I think, accidentally became the middle point between Hobbes and Locke. But he was really the first one to make a concrete action for the founding fathers to find a path to democratic principles. And Rousseau came from Paris, from Geneva. He wrote to Diderot, but fell out with him and some other philosophers. In 1762, he published The Social Contract, which laid the theoretical foundation for democracy. And it proposed that human beings left to their own are basically good, but the government is the only possible when people enter into a contract with it. So government has a role in making sure that people are not only following the laws, that they have to control people in some way, but that people also have to be willing to be a part of that government. And that is an essential part, that if you are not willing to be governed, then you don't have to follow those government rules, or at least there is that inherent social contract between the government and the people. And democratic transparency was inherent in his text, and there were no privilege to that. He probably had the most dangerous idea of the Enlightenment because it actually gave action to the ideas of Locke and Hobbes, where Locke and Hobbes kind of argued about, or at least theoretically, were the polar opposites of one another about actual human evolution, who human beings were. Rousseau was the first one to actually lay out a theoretical argument about it and put something forward that could be actionable. And that really is the most dangerous part about this, and one of the key ways that the revolution happened, that the United States Revolution, the French Revolution, and many other democratic revolutions began happening because of Rousseau. And that's why he is essential. There will be more videos about all these guys, Locke, Hobbes, and Rousseau. I definitely tell you to look into them because it kind of crystallizes the ideas a little bit more and helps you understand them more. So in order to understand how these thoughts actually became actual consequences, we have to really understand the Reformation first. And it's key to understanding the Enlightenment and the Revolution. The 16th century begins with Martin Luther's challenge to church authority, to the Roman Catholic Church. And the papal authority was at odds with monarchs and Germanic priests. So Martin Luther was a German citizen. The church was corrupt, and he felt that ecclesiastically neglected. It had this irrational dogma. It was also in power of priests and popes and buying offices and indulgences. So not only was the church corrupt on its own level, but was kind of trying to corrupt the German process as well. It had scholasticism, stifled learning, where the clergy only were the ones who were educated. There was a movement to reform the church and try to reform these sort of things. The Reformation confirms papal authority in Western Christendom. It also opens the road to Protestantism. The Protestant Reformation was a huge challenge to papal authority and to the church's authority. It was a scary moment for the church because this was the first time somebody had really stood up to the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church was so powerful in Europe that it really did decide governments. It decided who would be in charge. It decided who was who God determined to be the kings and queens of this time. And this ability to kind of control every power in Europe really made the church the most powerful institution in Europe. And this was the first moment where Protestantism really was challenging that authority. And the church didn't accept the reforms at all. It completely rejected them. The Protestant church is a byproduct of that challenge to papal authority almost 500 years ago. In the late 17th century, the issue was still not resolved. And it kind of challenged on who was the number one religion at this point. And the Catholic Church still has a wide authority over Europe. In France, the solution was to allow Protestants to practice freely and live in peace, but one of the King Louis reversed that decision, and the French Protestants were persecuted. And obviously, France is a highly Catholic nation and still pretty much is to this day. In the United Kingdom, James II, who was Catholic, comes to the throne, and Protestants aren't allowed there. In England, the Protestants and the Huguenots make an alliance. Printed propaganda is printed to expose the monarchs and the Catholic Church of their authority. Actually, King James is removed and exiled in 1688 via the Glorious Revolution. William II took over in 1689, and he established the English Bill of Rights. And this was a big moment for the eventual founding of our own Bill of Rights. But the English Bill of Rights was extremely important to establishing basic human rights for citizens, including habeas corpus, which was trial by jury, which we'll definitely talk about as we get into our own Bill of Rights. This kind of established that first idea that people in a society should have some form of government, and their government should protect those rights too. It's not just that government is not only not allowed to infringe on those rights, it's that government should actively protect those rights as well. And Locke's two treatises on government, this is where John Locke's two treatises on government was published in the United Kingdom in 1690. And he really showed that there was no divine rights attached to monarchs, to oligarchs, or to wealth. Legislators owe power to the people through a contract. And he was, again, this is where his social contract theory really came into effect. Locke believed that educated men should be able to govern, not just because you have wealth or power. It should be educated men who are the ones who are leading a society because they are the best able to be governed. In 1693, some thoughts concerning education advocated for gentlemen to become the magisterial class, meaning that Locke wanted people to use education to their advantage and really establish themselves and give themselves rights because they had been more educated. And at this point, too, more and more people were being educated. There were schools that were being available, at least for boys at this point. Boys were going and at least learning how to read and write and to establish themselves as, and give themselves rights, not just in the upper class, but also there was a growing portion of middle class as well that was growing at this point. So a lot of this was coming into effect where if these are the essential ideas in our own government, which we'll talk about, is that an educated public is essential for a democracy. And so Locke is really laying the foundations of democratic principles of people being educated in order to participate in their government. So what made Locke's ideas and thesis possible? First, usually was the divine right to contra. This is the way things are. That people would say that things are the way they are just because they are, and not really try to explain why. Science was that first step for Locke to question the social aspects of human beings, not just the science in the world around us, but also how human beings are supposed to interact with the world around them. Science really was beginning to take authority over religion, and the common element was this arbitrary authority. What someone tells you is what it is, and that's it, period. Science presented this new standard for arriving at the truth. It was finding fact and reason and logic in the way that they looked at the world. And Isaac Newton relied on experiment by trial and error. So Isaac Newton developed the scientific theory. Whenever he had been in science class, I'm sure you guys have been taught how to present an idea, test the idea, and then come up with a conclusion based on the test that you ran. And sometimes that theory might be proved true or it might be proved false. And that's how we run science today, too. This is how science is done in our world. And this was the same theories and principles was what Locke was trying to do. He was trying to prove that using theory and reason, that man had divine rights. Each individual person had divine rights. They had a belief that mathematical regularity and laws ruled the universe. The Glorious Revolution, so that really altered the laws of man regarding government. And Locke grasped this concept in the new rules regarding government. And he basically said, if humans could discover the laws of universal gravitation, surely they could govern themselves by the light of reason and constitutional government. In effect, a Newtonian system of government. So really taking the ideas of Newton and the way that Newton presented his theories, this is how he began to look at the world around them, and especially the governments around them. And religion presented the problem of how to prove belief. New forms of social activity tied to the church were becoming acceptable too. And people began to discuss these ideas. And that's where we really get the public sphere. And in this late 17th century and early 18th century, cities come into their own. So Paris, France, London, many European capitals in Italy, and all these different places where people could come together and really start to discuss the ideas that were presented to them. Two new opportunities were found there. One is the Masonic lodges, and two is salons. Freemasons set up a secret society called lodges, and this grew out of social clubs for working Masons. They were social initially, but they sought to inoculate civic virtue. They had an emphasis on living by laws and constitutions and voting. They had oratory and charity as part of their Masonic life. Lodges had altars in the center of the meeting room. So it was almost like a religious experience as well, but it was through the ideas of reason. And the written constitution was placed at the center of the tabernacle. Again, it sounds very religious. And lodges had rituals, and rituals were knowledge is light. It appealed to a brotherhood of knowledge and reason. The churches feared these lodges. Really, the first ideas of voting and rituals were non-abolitionist, and science and new ideas were freely discussed in the lodges as well. And this wasn't just men, too. This was also women as well. Women participated. Men were more present in the Masonic lodges. The salons were another thing. Their more common contribution came from salons. And it's not the hair salons that we think of today, but the idea is still similar. It's where people would go to socialize and hang out. It's almost like a coffee shop. There were rooms and homes where wealthy could open up to selected guests. And at salons, ideas were discussed. Books were read, plays were staged, music was performed. So this was continuation of a growing of culture. So if you could read, and you could read to people who were there and share ideas with one another, that was an open invitation to discussing and really questioning the world around them. In fact, early recordings of salon topics that included journals and gazettes made women intellectual public figures, that they were considered just as important as their male counterparts. And inherent in this is seen as some Masonic lodge rituals was a notion of equality. And it challenged the ideas of the masculine notions of authority in the society in general. So men and women were really considered equals. And that is an important step. And while there's still certainly work to be done even still to this day for women's rights especially, women began to find themselves more politically active and more educated and began to take a more active role in society than they ever had before. And a really key portion of the growing philosophy during this time, because scientific method and increasing education, the paradigms were shifting. No longer is the student to accept the paradigm, except they must question as well. So students were encouraged to not only question the world around them, but to look at how to fix certain parts of it too, and really try to understand that maybe there could be something better, and that the philosophers of old only could go so far in what they thought. And really, that was the complexity of thought in this area is open to interpretation. One of these important philosophers is Descartes, and he discussed discourse on method. And it's perhaps the first important work on this certain topic. He encourages readers to examine every thought for its coherence and to use skepticism as a means to question all ideas, particularly if it's stated to be truth. So if something is stated as truth, then there's a way that you could question that. And the beginnings of this shift is from scholasticism to humanism with science as material. So using science and reason in order to try to push forward that shift. And philosophers began to place themselves above the ideas of the classic philosophers such as Aristotle and Socrates. They began to really make their own interpretations of things, not just continually regurgitate the things from Aristotle and Socrates, but to really make their own philosophies. And that was an important step. This put it in direct conflict with religious authority. One philosophical treatise incorporated the science of the day, attacked religion like no other. And this is by John Verose of the Netherlands. And it was Treatise of Three Impostors. And the premise was that Jesus, Moses, and Muhammad are the three biggest con men in history. And this is really, really controversial. It'd be controversial now. It was especially controversial then. And all these elements combined, humanism and materialism, and led to the conclusion that reasonableness is the key to virtuous living. It was just another stab at order and control. And gazettes and journals gave way to travel logs. Some became fictionalized novels. Tools calling for reform to change. And all this began to really target certain aspects of society. And one of those aspects that they were targeting and that philosophers began to openly question was the slave trade. And through that push on the slave trade, the slave trade was abolished, at least in France and the United Kingdom, early in the 19th century. This began the premise of enlightenment and equal rights for man. We have a very storied history with slavery, and that's something that we will talk about as we go along in this class. Our history with slavery is very controversial, of course. And the Founding Fathers actually knew when they were writing the Declaration of Independence and many other things, just how hypocritical their own writing was, because they knew just how horrible slavery was, but they were writing about the individual ideas of man and freedom and giving freedom to man and letting man make their own choices, and yet they had slaves. Some of them did. And that is really hypocritical. And they called themselves out in it too. And I think at the time, we'll talk more about this in later weeks, but it's interesting to see how this was the beginning. The philosophers were really beginning to question why there was the premise of enlightenment where there was equal rights for man, but yet there were still slaves. And that really came into full force when the United Kingdom and France were like, okay, we have to get rid of slavery, and they just decided that maybe this was time to get rid of it. And they I think with us, it took a little bit longer because we as a country were still building, and cheap labor happens to come from slavery, very unfortunate. And that's just what ended up happening, is that we were trying to build a country and we had slaves, and in order to try to save some money and try to build it too. And then now, we were about 50 years short of France and the United Kingdom actually getting rid of slavery as well. But they were both big, powerful governments at that point who could afford it. So the Glorious Revolution really established the English Bill of Rights and many other things, but it also established monarchy with a parliament. The Glorious Revolution was really that first step of the transition between us accepting monarchical rule and monarchies into more democratic societies. And it was still a pretty heavily controlled monarchy at this point, but it gave monarchy and parliament both similar interests in power. Parliament could come up with laws, and then the monarch in England could veto it. And that also began this kind of idea of maybe we should have veto powers, and the president should sign off on laws. That really began this huge transition from us accepting a monarchy into democracies, and with just a little bit of stopover in between. It was not that way in France. France was an absolute monarchy, and they had a really hard time, and it's probably more of why their revolution was much more violent. There was no freedom of press or habeas corpus. Diderot was the one who was actually jailed too. The guy who wrote the encyclopedia, he was jailed. But it was really a hard time. It was really tough for the French, and that's why Rousseau came in. And as I talked about before, Rousseau wrote those ideas of social contract and of the government, and that's where his ideas became really dangerous, because you have this very controlling monarchy in France who was trying to keep its absolute power, and in Britain, where they gave the power to the people in Parliament, so it kind of controlled and abated English monarchy still being acceptable. The monarchs are still here today, so that's part of the reason why, is because they had a good transition from being a monarchy to a democratic society, and slowly over time the monarchs have lost their power. But now France doesn't have any monarchy, and there's a reason for that. And so Rousseau's work briefly energized opposition philosophers, Masons, and supporters. It was supported by the church and conservative policies, actually, and it also caused monarchs to tighten hold on their people and colonies too. And this is why Rousseau's ideas are put out there, and Britain starts to be a little bit more, they're fine with giving the rights to the actual people who live in the United Kingdom, but the colonies were a different story. That was where things got a little dicey. That crackdown happened between 1762 and 1775 in the United States especially, and this is where the revolution starts to come into full effect. This tightening of the grip started hurtling people towards a new direction of government and to really to push against the monarchies that were in power. And people were now giving their consent to be governed, or were going to fight to get their set of rights. And that was really what it was going to be. There was going to be a choice between whether people were going to be governed or whether they were going to have their rights and fight for it. And many violent and long revolutions happened over the next 200 years because people are fighting for their rights, even still to this day. So that is it for week 1. If you guys have any questions, again, please let me know. Hopefully, if you need to go back and listen to something, you can find more information on it. Again, I encourage you guys to ask questions on our discussion board. If there is something that I can help with. I really do look forward to seeing what you guys think about this lecture and about the week going forward. Take your time with the readings. If you need help with them, let me know. And I'm very excited to keep going. And next week, we're going to go right into the history of democracies and where this started to come from. Because it didn't just start in the Enlightenment period. It was also very ancient form, and we'll talk about why those were failures, yet ours still continues to this day, and we'll talk about why that is. So I look forward to seeing you guys next week, and again, please let me know if you need anything from me.